and finite. Then in the chemical period, they were broad, general, and decadal. Think of Rachel Carson's brilliant book, Silent Spring. And now in the modern industrial age, alterations are global, comprehensive, and perhaps even millennial in duration. We also see a condition known as shifting benchmarks, and that challenges our definition of defining what a restoration goal really is. For example, when I was in graduate school and beginning to study restoration, I would often think back on my childhood to what the Palmer River looked like, and I would think, oh, maybe I can restore it back to that. And then with further reading, I understood that the marshes looked very different earlier in our American history. But now we have a new generation of scientists coming on board, and as they reflect back to their childhood of the 1990s, they see a very different restoration goal. And with climate change, it's difficult to impossible to get back to some of these historic conditions because the ground is literally changing underneath us in terms of temperature and sea level. So when I was a young person, I saw salt marshes as long-lived, resilient, and stable, but dynamic. And now I see them as relatively rapidly changing and demanding a significant reconfiguration of my thinking. 100 years from now, though, we will have a coastline. I mean, just by definition. In his book, Hot, Flat, and Crowded 2.0, Thomas Friedman coined the phrase global weirding to describe the combination of climate change effects that will be manifested from extended droughts to more intense and frequent storms. And I think this winter we've had a lot of global weirding. I recall hearing on NPR in November 2014, that we were on track to pass a breakpoint in temperature gains, beyond which we would not be able to avoid some of the more severe consequences of global warming. And as of March 2015, global carbon dioxide levels have passed 400 parts per million. These levels likely will remain high, although there are these seasonal fluctuations between summer and winter. This far above the 350 parts per million has been recognized as many as going beyond the limit sustaining life as we know it on planet Earth. We have heard that even if we stop CO2 increases, the effects will remain for 100 or hundreds of years. We've also heard about long-term rates in sea level rise. This is a chart from Boston, Massachusetts. Over the long term, the sea level rise rate is 2.8 millimeters per year, something that a healthy salt marsh can cope with. But a more recent short-term estimate has the rate at a greater level of 13 millimeters per year. So the long-term trend is this dark line, but if we look back to, say, 1980, our short-term trend would be a much steeper line. And healthy salt marshes can't keep pace with 13 millimeters per year. The interaction between rising temperatures and sea levels is changing the coastline. What I want you to notice is that despite our human alterations from the 1600s through the 1900s, a period of 300 years, there was very little alteration to the Quincy shoreline. But in just the next 85 years, that coastline is predicted to be significantly different. So this image is based on a 6-foot change in sea level by the year 2100. And if we go back to my river that I grew up on, the same is true for the Palmer, a location much less urbanized than Quincy, but not any less susceptible to an estimated 8-foot sea level rise in the year 2012. I'm going to skip nutrient and temperature effects because it's a little bit esoteric. And I'm going to pause because I think we need a breather. Let me pause for a moment and consult another famous New Englander, Robert Frost. He's always offered words of wisdom. In 1923, he wrote the famous poem, Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening. Let me read it to you, and if you know the words, you can certainly join along. Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near, between the woods and frozen lake, the darkest evening of the year. He gives his harness bells a shake to ask if there is some mistake. The only other sounds the sweep of easy wind and downy flake. And now this part you'll all know. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. But you know, the scientist side of me is curious and wants to know just why those woods were so snowy and dark. Here I show the New Hampshire average annual temperature departure from the long-term average. So this line in the middle, that's 0, is the long-term average. And if it's a colder than average winter, you get a blue bar down below. And if it's a warmer than average winter, we get a yellow bar going up above. And we see in 1923, the first yellow arrow down here, that Robert Frost was writing during an extended cold period. And my ice skating adventures took place during some of the last truly cold winters. "100 years from now, we will have a coastline. But what about the salt marshes? The character of Dr. Ian Malcolm, played by Jeff Goldblum in Jurassic Park, you remember that from 1993, predicts that even in the most challenging circumstances, life finds a way. Though, as played out in the movie, it's not always what one might expect. For starters, we know from the work of McKee and Patrick in 1988, way back, that smooth cordgrass, Spartina alterniflora, can exist along a range of marsh elevations relative to a known tidal datum, like mean water or mean low water. Alterniflora, is a very hardy plant. Jim Morris's work refines the trend noted in that graph for local conditions. He took what he calls his salt marsh organ, like a pipe organ, and puts it in a location, and then sees where the grass grows best. This area has very little flooding, so is pretty stressed. This is underwater all the time, so it's not growing quite as well. The Goldilocks elevation is somewhere in here. He then plugs it into a model he calls his marsh equilibrium, or MEM, M-E-M model. And it describes an interactive system that's driven by elevation, inundation, and nutrients and sediment supply. So it helps us identify if our salt marshes are at that Goldilocks elevation. We might have a plant growing on our marsh, but maybe it's not doing as well as it might if it were at a slightly different elevation. We've done this sort of thing for other plant distributions, and this shows the elevations that salt marsh plants grow at Ninigret Pond. It's a salt marsh pond or salt pond or coastal lagoon on the southern shore of Rhode Island, kind of near Point Judith. This graph is taken from an area that has a very small tidal range, just 1 or 2 feet, not our 9 to 12 or 16 foot tides up here. And I think it would be really valuable for us to generate graphs like this throughout New England with different tidal ranges and different circumstances, so we could really get a handle on where these salt marsh plants feel most at home. So where is the vegetation trending now? People have spent a lot of time talking about marsh migration or salt marsh creep, a tedious millimeter by millimeter effort. But I have seen jumping Juncus girardi. In this case at Barn Island, Connecticut, Juncus has jumped over high tide bush and has started growing underneath the deciduous tree canopy. It's a little hard to see, but this bright green grass is the black grass or Juncus girardi. These are oak trees. And this is something known as high tide bush, which grows at the high tide line. We don't have it here in Maine. It comes up to northern Massachusetts and coastal New Hampshire. It's just a little bit south of us. So this black grass didn't creep millimeter by millimeter. Wherever its seeds and rhizomes got tossed by the storms, it would start to grow there. And it seems to be doing pretty well. Similarly, in this shot, this is from my hometown, it looks like the seawall is going to create what we call marsh squeeze and prevent the salt marsh migration upslope. But on closer inspection, as if you were jogging along this road, which I do from time to time, you can see Spartina patens growing on top of the stone wall. It's admittedly just a few strands of salt marsh grass on top of that wall, but why not take advantage of it and the inevitable loss of the road? There, doesn't that look much better? So we can have salt marshes migrating inland. We actually do already. But, oh, here we go. Yeah, we can remove the road. Things will be great. There are actually other roads that go to that area, so it's not a requirement that that road be there. There are other points of access. Similarly, this marsh in Wells is doing just fine with migration if only the landowner would stop mowing it as part of their extended lawn. And we see this in a number of sites. Here again, what's with the mowing? This is a salt marsh in Connecticut. And we're going to zoom in right here. So over here, this is the salt marsh. And it's being mowed as part of a parking lot. While we won't be gaining thousands of acres with these few measures, we still will gain a variety of ecosystem services, from carbon sequestration to wildlife habitat. And as economists tell you, what happens at the margin is all important. And that's our mowed area. I'm going to skip this. It's thought that we might lose some species of plants, particularly the forbs, or the tiny little flowering plants. And you should know that Kew Gardens in the United Kingdom has what's known as the Millennial Seed Bank. And they have a number of salt marsh and wetland plants in their archive of plants that they're trying to save. We had someone come visit us not long ago from the Kew Gardens collecting salt marsh plants, or seeds from the salt marsh plants. So in summary, while many plant species may be able to cope with accelerated sea level rise, suites of wildlife species might not be so quick to adapt. One that many of you will know is the salt marsh sparrow. It's an obligate salt marsh nester. It doesn't nest anywhere else on the planet. It only occurs in the eastern United States. And because of all of that, it's a species of national and global conservation concern. It builds its nest just a few centimeters above the marsh surface, and because of that, is susceptible not only to rising sea levels, but also to storm tides. And all this sparrow can re-nest during the same summer, Accelerated sea level and higher than normal tides challenge the marshes to provide nesting sites at safe elevations. Indeed, when Chris Field modeled the salt marsh sparrow nesting windows, he found that by 2050, sea level rise and higher tides would have flooded sparrow nests too frequently for any significant nesting success. That, in fact, the species is likely to go extinct in absence of any intervention. This has caused my colleague Wenley to call the salt marsh sparrow the polar bear of the salt marsh. So unlike previous restoration efforts, we need to choose and develop restoration techniques that will result in sustainable marshes that can keep pace with sea level rise. And if the marshes can't be made sustainable, then we need to aim for greater resilience. We also need to think about providing a transition from the current footprint of the salt marsh to some future projected footprint. This involves protecting marsh migration corridors, but also more. We need to be really creative to try things that might not normally have been acceptable, and to keep our eye on providing for the present as well as the future. Just going to show a quick example. This is Hazard Road in Newport, Rhode Island. It's an area that had been flooded and filled with filamentous green algae. The marsh was decaying. And my colleague Wenley installed what we're calling runnels, these small shovel excavated channels that just drain that surface water off the top of the marsh. It's not a ditch like all the other ditches that we've seen. So here's what it looks like on the ground level, and that had all been flooded and not supporting any vegetation. Here are a few more sites of runnels. Again, it was all flooded in the spring, but by the fall it was growing vegetation. Fall a year later. A couple more locations. Again, the same pattern. Here it was pretty mucky and unstable, and here it's fairly dry, and the marsh peat was firming up underneath it. I mean, what the heck was a runnel? We didn't even talk about these things 8 years ago. And another example of a unique or innovative restoration technique is known as thin layer deposition. This is at the Big Egg, Jamaica Bay, New York. And more recently, it's been used in Rhode Island on the John Chafee National Wildlife Refuge. What they do is they take dredge material, often it comes from outside of the salt marsh embayment, and it's sprayed with a hydraulic dredger up onto the salt marsh. This one doesn't look like it's getting very far, but depending upon the nozzle and the amount of water that's entrained and the grain size, you can get this going a couple hundred feet. Here's a demo project on Rhode Island. Again, this was just very small, a couple of yards by a couple of yards. And here's a much larger project that was done on Long Island, Seatuck National Wildlife Refuge. They had a channel dredging project that was going on anyway. And so they took the sediment from that channel dredge along with some old dredge spoil that had been placed on the refuge. They liquefied it and then sprayed it over many acres of salt marsh, and then used these track vehicles like snowcats to get it to the right elevation. And then we'll let natural colonization take over and go from there. In some cases, you would want to plant these. In locations like this ditch salt marsh in Newburyport, Massachusetts, we are embarking on a pilot project that I call ditch remediation. We actually first tried it at Rachel Carson National Wildlife Refuge in Kennebunk, one of our marshes. So we call it ditch remediation, and what we do is we harvest the natural growing salt hay grasses and then rake them into the bottom of the ditch. and just hold it down with some natural twine. We might have to do that a couple of times until we get the elevation high enough for plants to just start naturally growing in the ditch. So we heal the ditch through natural processes. It's really important to know, though, that we don't fill all the ditches and that we have to examine the site as a whole to see what the tidal ebb and flow is. The tide's got to come in, but the tide also has to go out again. And we also realize that we must return to these sites for some farmer-like tweaking over time. Here's a photo from our site at Goose Rocks in Maine, just putting down the salt hay and the twine. That twine is going to get lowered. Here I am holding up some of that salt hay once it's been packed down into the ditch. And this is in Parker River National Wildlife Refuge in Newburyport. This is an April shot with the grass in the marsh, and you can't see where that ditch was really without looking very closely. So this technique holds a lot of promise for healing some of those areas that are ditched too much. And for the sake of time, I'm just going to scoot through these next slides. Say that nutrients in groundwater are really important. They seem to be having a role in the stability of our salt marshes. Salt marshes are normally low nutrient and slow growing ecosystems. If we add a lot of nutrients either through lawn runoff or septic systems or wastewater treatment facilities, we can undermine the stability of those salt marshes. Some tidal marsh recovery guidelines might be to preserve large areas, like the entire Scarborough Marsh, to remove human-induced stressors, to give the natural processes the best opportunity for a healthy marsh, to restore a transition framework to build in linkages to a future footprint, and to preserve bio and genetic diversity. Additionally, we want to learn from that marsh elevation model, that MEM model, and address any processes, whether it's sedimentation or elevation or plant growth, that seem to be deficient. We should think about sustainable use. We can't overuse any one of those ecosystem services because it will imperil the salt marsh itself. And we need to reduce conflicts, whether it's by nutrient addition to the watershed or excessive dredging and subsidence. So 100 years from now, we will have a coastline. How it looks will largely depend upon us and people like us. How can I be so sure? Edward Lorenz, who coined the phrase, the butterfly effect, also thought that the chaos theory revealed that as small as we are, we can have an influence on the world. I would like to thank the Quincy Historical Society for the use of their archives and the Massachusetts Historical Society for access to the Adams paper. I have a number of mentors with whom I've grown, and I've relied upon their guidance over the years. Special thanks to Edward Fitzgerald of the Quincy Historical Society, who let me camp out in his office for many occasions, and for his guidance to those valuable map resources. But before I wax too poetic on all my mentors and helpers, I'd like to remind us of Amelia Boynton Robinson. She was beaten and left for dead on the Edmund Pettus Bridge 53 years ago on the march to Selma. She recovered and became the Queen Mother of the Civil Rights Movement. And young people often say that they are standing on her shoulders. And what was her response? Get off my shoulders. There's work to be done. So this is our challenge. Our way forward must include preserving as much salt marsh as possible, ensuring the survival of coastal species, planning and preparing for a future marsh footprint, and lastly, bringing our message home. This is our challenge and our legacy. Someone asked me recently if I was despondent about the impending loss of our coastal marshes. No, I am not despondent. I am resolved. Thank you.